Welcome to you all. Those of you that haven't met me, which isn't many, I'm Dominic Barrington, I'm the Dean of the Cathedral. It's lovely to be in partnership with Bexley Seabury, lovely to have Roger and Susie with us, and particularly lovely to have Professor Mark Chapman with us to talk a little bit about life in the Anglican Communion. Over to you, Mark.
Right, well, thank you. I guess most of you would have picked up over the last few weeks there was a meeting in Canterbury which had repercussions for the Episcopal Church after that. The primates of the 38, all 38 primates, plus the primate of the Anglican Church in North America, gathered in Canterbury to discuss the future of Anglicanism, particularly in relation to same-sex relations and the changing of the canon at last summer's General Convention by the Episcopal Church, and to work out what kind of repercussions that might have for the future of the Anglican Communion. And what I thought I'd do this morning is to just look at a slightly longer term history to why Anglicanism as a whole has found it difficult to deal with international problems. And that's the main focus will be trying to work out what kind of thing Anglicanism is at a kind of global level, and how it addresses authority questions, how it addresses issues of dispute and issues of conflict between the different churches. So if you thought you were going to get something else, now's the time to go. And I thought one way of sort of just, if you don't recognise the man on the right there in the picture, it is in fact the Archbishop of Canterbury on Good Friday taking up his cross. And there is a sense probably that anybody who has the misfortune to be appointed Archbishop of Canterbury is not going to have an easy time over the next few years. And I think one of the reasons that Justin Welby was appointed was his experience as a reconciler or a conflict solver during his time in Coventry Cathedral. He was head of the Ministry of Reconciliation, as they call it, at Coventry Cathedral, which is specialised in peace building and trying to overcome conflict in different places, partly out of the history of that particular cathedral, having been rebuilt after the Second World War. But to start off with another picture, with the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, who has, it must be said, a rather more distinctive appearance. A couple of weeks ago I showed this slide to a group at Georgetown University in Washington, not an Anglican institution, and not a single person recognised that image, which was quite interesting. I mean, it was a group of bright young students studying all sorts of different courses. Most of them, I think, wanted to run the world. But not a single one recognised Rowan Williams. And that says something about the kind of international status of Anglicanism and its kind of global reach, and how much it is, we tend to get a little bit fixated on it, but others outside think of it as a rather modest church. And obviously, if you're thinking through what kind of thing Anglicanism is, it's good to bear in mind how you work out what a global identity is in the first place. So two obvious other global trademarks there. And one of them is very interesting because there's no words attached to it. It is simply that symbol, which obviously connects with original sin. Anyway, but that's the apple's been eaten. But that sort of thing, you know, what kind of brand is Anglicanism, and how do we define that brand? What kind of quality control does it have? Those are questions that I think are ones that one needs to sort of have in the back of the mind, one's mind as we go on. And I think that's the sort of thing that I'll come back to in a minute, just by looking at a very sort of brief overview of a bit of history, because I'm basically a historian. I've written a lot on Anglican history, Anglican identity, but I'm basically a historian and tend to look at things in that kind of longer perspective. So I'm not going to look just at sort of the presenting issues today, but look at why things have been particularly problematic over the last few years, and how that relates to a wider Anglican So first of all, two figures from the Anglican past who are rather more relatively identifiable. Henry VIII, obviously, a great figure in Anglican identity. But one of the key things that I think I'd want to emphasise from the very beginning of the separation of the Church of England from the wider Catholic Church was very much the idea of what was called at the time imperial authority. If you know your Tudor history, you'll know that Thomas Cromwell wrote a preamble to the Act in Restraint of Appeals. In other words, he couldn't take any appeals outside of England. And it starts off with a fairly monumental sentence: "This realm of England is an empire." In other words, all authority has to be exercised solely within the realm of England, and nobody else, least of all the Bishop of Rome, has any right to interfere with anything within the realm of England. And that's absolutely central for the identity of the Church of England. So Cromwell writes this, Cromwell advises the king, and it's very much that emphasis on an independent authority solely for England. Now, what does that say about the nature of the Catholic Church? If you're thinking through the Catholic Church as a worldwide church, a universal church, if you're then saying that all authority within that church is to be contained within the realm of England, that obviously creates difficulties when you're thinking through how you conceive that at a kind of spatial level. What does it mean to be a Catholic Church if the authority is solely within the realm of England? How then does the Church of England relate to all those other churches outside of England? And that becomes an obvious problem for Anglicans from the very beginning. And if you've ever looked at the English Book of Common Prayer, the very first edition of it, it says the rites and ceremonies for the use of the Church of England, implying there are obviously other churches. But what relationship does the Church of England have to those other churches? And that's what I call, in many ways, I call the Anglican problem, in a sense that the churches that now form the Anglican Communion all come out of this understanding of the nature of authority, whereby authority is limited solely to the independent churches. And in a sense, at the beginning, that was less of a problem, obviously, because it was contained within the realm of England, England and Wales, at that stage, and that was what the Church of England was. I'll just pause there. Anybody want to? I don't want to go too fast or too slow, but I'll just stop it. If anybody's got any questions or thoughts about that. So let's move on just to one or two issues in relation to a few later developments. Again, I can't give you a whole overview of Anglican history and Anglican identity, but just two important aspects of what happens as Anglicanism gains an identity outside of England or beyond England. Initially, as you're probably aware, there are chaplains sent out to the different parts of the British colonies overseas, of which obviously the eastern seaboard colonies of New England and further south are obviously places that have a relationship to the Church of England. They are always places with a number of different denominations, but English chaplains are sent to serve those colonies, and they organise themselves in slightly different ways, but they come under the oversight, obviously, of the Church of England, and it becomes institutionalised in the Bishop of London, having authority outside of England in all the churches overseas, and that includes the churches in America. But I want to start not with America, but with Scotland, which is an interesting case study of how Anglicanism first develops outside of England. Americans have a habit of calling people from the country that I come from, which is the United Kingdom, calling us Brits, which, if you're thinking through in relation to the church, is an extremely difficult and inaccurate term. There never has been a British church. It's always been a Church of England, and there's been a church in Ireland, and since 1920 there's also been a church in Wales. But the Church of Scotland has always been completely different and completely separate from the Church of England, and was, for most of its existence, has been a Presbyterian church, and remains a Presbyterian church. It's established, but established in a completely different way from the Church of England. 1688 is a significant event in the United Kingdom, because that's when we depose our Catholic king, King James, and substitute a Protestant king, King William, and his wife, Queen Mary, as monarchs over England and Scotland. And the issue there is a number of the Scottish clergy and all the bishops in Scotland, they had bishops at that stage, refused to swear their oath of allegiance to the king and become what they call non-jurors. And they then have to, in a sense, depart from the Church of Scotland and set up an independent church, which is a church which is not tolerated officially by the powers that be in Scotland. So they become a dissenting community. So the Episcopal Church of Scotland, as it soon gets called, the church that retains these bishops, non-juring bishops, becomes a church which is subversive. And it's subversive because it supports the Jacobites, it supports the Stuarts over and against the House of Orange, so William and Mary, who become King and Queen of England. And that creates a church which comes out of, in some ways, comes out of the Church of England, although it was always separate even beforehand. But it comes out of the Church of England and could be called, in some sense, an Anglican church. It uses a version of the English prayer book, the one that they tried to impose in Scotland that led to the Civil War in England. It uses that version of the prayer book, and yet it's out of communion with the Church of England because it is a subversive, dissenting community. So the first non-English Anglican church is questionably related to the Church of England. If a Scottish priest wanted to work in England, well, at that stage, he would have to be reordained, not simply have to swear a new oath of allegiance, he would actually have to be reordained. And that situation continued probably until the 1820s. There's not a lot of examples of it happening, but it probably continued to till the 1820s. Now that obviously creates an interesting question about what the nature of Anglicanism is. If the first church outside of England is not, strictly speaking, in communion with the Church of England, even though it could be called Anglican. Something just to bear in mind about what kind of identity then does this have. Now just relate that then to the Episcopal Church in the United States. What happens there? What's the relationship? I've just put a few of the early bishops. And obviously, swearing one's oath of allegiance to the crown is part and parcel of what it is to be ordained in the Church of England. I'm an Anglican priest in England, and what I have to do when I'm ordained is to swear my oath of allegiance to the crown, still. Now, if you've just separated yourself off from the tyranny of the British Crown in 1776, one of the interesting things to do is, if you're English, is to go to Boston and walk around the Freedom Trail. And you can see how important that sort of identity is for the American nation is about casting off the tyranny of an outside power. So if you're thinking through how that relates to the sort of identity that the Church of England might have had at the beginning, in a sense, this realm of America is not necessarily an empire, but it's a republic, completely independent then of that old crown. It set up its own identity, completely separate from that crown. Now, there are, at the stage of that sort of revolutionary period, a significant number of members of the Church of England, as they were, didn't really approve of Republican government at all and moved further north towards what's now Canada. But around about 7,000 remained in the new republic. So it was a very small church, 7,000 people remain in the Church of England, but obviously have to work out what kind of identity they can possibly have if they're no longer under the authority of the British Crown. The other problem for the American Church is that there aren't any bishops either. The bishops, as I said earlier, they'd come under the oversight of the Bishop of London. There are no bishops resident on this side of the Atlantic. But if this new church is to be independent, then there needs to be some sort of episcopacy. And where do you get that from? And you'll know the story probably that initially, well, you've got Samuel Seabury, who's a complex person, and his relationship with the people of Connecticut wasn't necessarily as strong as it might have been. But anyway, he goes off to London to seek ordination as a bishop, and they can't ordain him bishop because he can't swear his oath of allegiance to the crown. So he moves up to Scotland to bishops in Aberdeen, and is ordained as a bishop there by the Episcopal Church of Scotland, which is not at that stage, as I said, in communion with the Church of England. So you've got that issue about what kind of church is the Episcopal Church, and where does its authority stem from, and how does that then relate to the Church of England? What prayer book does it use? Well, one of the deals with the Scottish Episcopal Church is that the American Episcopal Church would adopt not the English prayer book, but that modified version of the prayer book that was used in Scotland. So from the very beginning, it wasn't the English Book of Common Prayer that was being used, it was the Scottish Book of Common Prayer that was being used in the United States. Obviously you then get the creation of an identity, an establishment of kind of structures of authority of the Episcopal Church, the General Convention, the House of Deputies, the House of Bishops. And you create a structure which is completely autonomous from the Church of England, so that the authorities of the Church of England have can exercise no power, no authority outside of England at all. The American Church becomes completely autonomous. It's also completely autonomous in the sense that it doesn't have any relationship to political structures either. The importance of the separation of church and state is obviously very crucial to the American identity and the constitutional identity. So what kind of bishop are you going to have? An English bishop sits at that stage. All the English bishops were still sitting in Parliament, in the House of Lords. They were ecclesiastical functionaries, but they were also political functionaries. They had power to exercise within the state as well as the church. But obviously in the American church, you're exercising your authority in a completely different way, apart from the state, quite in a completely independent way. And that creates a different understanding of episcopacy from the very beginning. They may be called bishops, but what they do is very different from what an English bishop would do. They are functionaries over a church, but don't have any kind of broader role than that. And I won't go into any details, but a lot of the writing on episcopacy at the very beginning of the American church was talking quite frequently about primitive episcopacy. And what they meant by primitive episcopacy was non-political episcopacy. So this was a form of episcopacy that was exercised in the early church, on their view, before the church was ever established. So it's a kind of pre-Constantinian episcopacy. And that gave bishops a kind of independence that they'd never had within England. So there's no kind of political responsibility at all for the American bishops. And I guess William White in particular sets that kind of pattern going in the early years of the 19th century. And so the American church gradually gains an identity as a kind of national church with its own distinctive ethos. But again, it's completely different from that of the Church of England. And then if an American priest wanted to work in England, again, he would have to be reordained. They did change the rules about being able to appoint bishops for territories outside of the jurisdiction of the British Crown. So by the end of the 18th century, they were allowed to do that in England, and to appoint priests who didn't have to swear their oath of allegiance to the Crown. But nevertheless, they were still members of the Church of England working outside of England. But the American Church, completely independent, no canonical jurisdiction from the Church of England outside of England in that new Episcopal Church, which gradually gets stronger, gradually gains an identity and becomes very much very rapidly becomes a pretty wealthy church. Having been a small beleaguered minority at the time of the Revolution, it gradually gains strength through the 19th century. Again, I'll pause just there. Any questions or thoughts? Okay, just a couple more questions. This is obviously a what happens next sort of slide. First of all, I suppose it's worth mentioning that the American Church becomes extremely important at providing an example for the English Church later on in the 19th century. As I said, those bishops were exercising their authority on the primitive model. And one of the most important bishops in 19th century England was a man called Samuel Wilberforce, who was the son of the slave emancipator, who was bishop of my diocese in Oxford. Samuel Wilberforce had written a book on the American Episcopal Church in the late 1830s. What was happening at that as the American nation was expanding westwards, they set up a new way of doing bishops. So instead of having a bishop who would be called after they've planted a few churches and then they would appoint a bishop, they did it round the other way. They consecrated a bishop who would then establish a church. So you put the bishop there first. Lots of particularly the kind of Anglo-Catholics in Oxford, thought you needed a bishop in order to have a church. This was the example that they used with Jackson Kemper, who was the first bishop of Wisconsin, so this part of the world was initially planted by these missionary bishops. This became an example for what might happen in parts of the British Empire. So in 1840 they set up a fund called the Colonial Bishoprics Fund, which would plant bishops in different parts of the British Empire. But before that, Anglicans had been, or the English Church had been quite active in establishing churches overseas. And if you look at your map, the map there, the world map of the British Empire, those places coloured red. If you look at Africa, you'll find in West Africa there's some small colonies there, and the Church Missionary Society, which was established at the end of the 18th century, was set up to plant churches, to establish churches in, initially in India and in Africa. So rather than pointing towards the Americas, which is what the earlier Society for the Propagation of the Gospel had done, they directed their attention towards Africa. And they grew directly out of the evangelical revival. And in general, evangelicals have not had paid particular attention to the importance of episcopacy. So a lot of what they did was to establish churches without bishops, coming under the oversight of, loosely, of the Church of England, but really creating their own sort of chaplaincies in different parts of the British Empire, and particularly active in West Africa, and then significantly later on the other side of Africa, in East Africa, beginning in what we would now call Kenya and Uganda. So when one's thinking through what's happening is that you've got different models of Anglican identity being established in different parts of the world. So first of all, that CMS evangelical identity, you raise up a leadership after you've planted your churches. You then get the establishment in the 1840s onwards of colonial bishops who set up their churches by planting a bishop and then the church growing out of that bishop. And that particularly starts in southern Africa. And then you've got competing churches from those two different styles of doing church, if you like, happening in different parts, particularly in New Zealand, Australia, where you've got two different missionary societies kind of in competition with one another, which don't really share an understanding of what a bishop is for. So Anglican identity was always questionable, even within the churches of the British Empire, right through the 19th century. So if you think it's a problematic identity now, that's because it always was. And a lot of the churches that grew out of the different parties of 19th century English, the 19th century English church, retained those kind of identities right through. So the Church of Nigeria, which is the one that was particularly successful, coming out initially of Sierra Leone, which was the colony a bit like Liberia that was set up for freed slaves from the British Empire. That's where they start their mission, and gradually it moves eastwards into Nigeria. And that always retained a very strong affinity towards the Church Missionary Society and remained very much focused on the kind of evangelical ideals. And the same is true later, from the 1880s onwards, in East Africa, in Kenya and Uganda. So strong evangelical identity that comes out of those styles of church planting. From Southern Africa, it's a much more Anglo-Catholic identity that spreads northwards, and then a little bit later spreads from Zanzibar into Tanzania. It's now Tanzania. So there you've got competing. I don't know if people know the church in Tanzania is a fascinating church to this day, because the northern part is ultra-evangelical, the southern part is ultra-Anglo-Catholic, and it's supposed to be one church, but they have two completely separate identities. They have two theological colleges, and it's in a sense the different sort of missionary histories have created two very different identities. And this is quite a good example of just how the Anglican churches in Africa grow as the British Empire expands through the later part of the 19th century and then into the 20th. I have a picture here of just a couple of those early missionary bishops. Jackson Kemper, the first bishop of Wisconsin. George Washington Doane of New York preached the sermon called The Missionary Bishop, which became absolutely central to that kind of identity. So that's a little bit of background. And just then, let's go back to thinking through how does that then relate to the 1530s? How does that relate to the idea of England and the idea of Englishness in relation to the Anglican Communion? Here's a few pictures from across the Anglican Communion to this day. What kind of thing is it, and how does that relate to the original identity, if you like, coming out of England? What thing has emerged from that time? If you're thinking through these churches as they gradually gain their identity and gradually become independent, so that sense of identity that's rooted in somewhere outside gradually gets weaker, and so they become more contextual. But there's always that questionable and ambiguous relationship with the church of the past. And that's particularly true when that church of the past is the former colonizer, the former colonial power. So in Africa in particular, you've got from the 1960s, very late 1950s onwards, you've got African independence movements and gradual new republics being created in Africa. They've cast off the old colonial power, and gradually they gain a new identity, and these churches gradually become independent churches through the 1960s, establishing their own identity, which is ambiguous in its relationship to the Church of England, because obviously the Church of England is always associated with the colonial power. And so, in a sense, this is not dissimilar from what went on in the 1770s in this country, from what's happened from the 1960s onwards. What kind of church is created, and how does that relate to the Church of England as the church of the former coloniser? So a word or two a bit more about that in a second when we get to some disputes. Can we move forward? Doesn't seem to want to move forward. There we are. I don't know whether people have come across this character, William Reed Huntingdon, who was absolutely formative in creating a kind of global Anglican identity. And he did so at a particular time in a particular place, and that's been extraordinarily formative in trying to helping us understand really how Anglicans have related to one another at a global level. Huntingdon, if you look at his dates, is working particularly in that very kind of volatile period of American history during the Civil War and after the Civil War. And that is absolutely central for what happens to Anglicanism. He creates this understanding of Anglicanism as, he wrote a book once called American Catholicity. It's an interesting concept. He thought that Anglicanism was fundamentally about being Catholic, but also being a Catholic in a nation. After the Civil War, he wanted a church of what he called the reconciliation. So a church that was there for all people across the divides of American society. And he thought that it was Anglicanism that would be the key church for that new united identity coming out of the Civil War period. Now, if it's an Anglican identity, it's obviously not an English identity, because it's an American identity rather than an English identity. So he writes in quite strong and powerful rhetoric against the Church of England in a very typically American kind of way. It has a certain nostalgia for the Church of England. He rather likes the sort of the surplices and choral evensong and all that sort of thing. But he recognises that's not the church for the American people. The church for the American people is one that will give them an identity as people of the reconciliation, people who are Christians fundamentally, and not English fundamentally. So that's where its identity needs to come from. He actually went to England at the end of the 1860s and visited John Keeble's parish. John Keeble was one of the great leaders of the Anglo-Catholic revival in the 1830s and onwards. He went to his parish and he describes it, and he sort of talks about the kind of ivy-clad walls, and that this isn't really what Anglicanism is all about. It's not about sort of the past, it's about the future. It's about creating a church for the future. And so from his vantage point, he comes back, first of all in Massachusetts, and then he keeps getting elected bishop and refuses to take, he's really the most important figure in the House of Deputies. He produces the prayer book in the 1870s, so he's an extraordinarily important character in the development of the American church. And what he does is to write a book published in 1870 called The Church Idea, and he describes Anglicanism in terms of these 4 points. And this is the first statement of what he thinks Anglicanism is all about. And it's very simple and very minimal in terms of the definition. So you've got the Holy Scriptures as the Word of God, the primitive creeds as the rule of faith, and he means the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the 2 sacraments ordained by Christ himself, and the episcopate as the centre or keystone of governmental unity. Those are the key points of identity for him of the Anglican Church. And he likens them to the quadrilateral. The 1860s was a period of great warfare, and the quadrilateral was the 4 great fortresses of the Austrian army in northern Italy. That's where the word comes from. But the Church of the Reconciliation stands secure on these 4 props. And what's particularly obvious, if you're looking at them, is that there's nothing whatsoever about anything English. There's no Book of Common Prayer. There's no English articles of religion or anything like that. So Anglicanism is defined completely as simply being a Catholic Christian in that kind of minimal way, open to everybody who might want to come in. So being as expansive as you possibly can be in your definition of Anglicanism. Now, if you're English, you might think that's a rather poor definition of Anglican identity, because obviously you might want to have something a little bit more than that, particularly a liturgical identity. I mean, Anglicans have often sort of said that their identity comes in their liturgy, but here you've got an Anglican identity with no liturgy whatsoever. The reason being, Huntington wanted to include everybody, provided they would have that minimum understanding of things. And he even managed to get his Presbyterian friends to write books on the importance of the episcopate. He was a very influential and powerful character. Now, this wouldn't have mattered too much had it been just been a small publication by a prominent churchman, but the General Convention in 1886 in Chicago adopts the quadrilateral, those 4 points, as the identity for the American church. Anybody who might want to join the American church simply has to agree with those points. So again, it becomes a minimum kind of understanding of identity. It's slightly more developed. I won't read the thing out, but it's slightly more developed than you get in the initial ideas with Huntington. But you've then got this being sort of becomes the official theology, if you like, of the American Episcopal Church. It's still there in the back of your 1979 Book of Common Prayer in the historic formularies section. Don't quite know what status that has, therefore, but it's still there in the back of the prayer book. So you want to come into our church, this is all you have to do. Now that is then becomes quite formative for the next stage when Anglicans, bishops from across the world meet 2 years later at Lambeth, at the Lambeth Conference, to come to an understanding about what is Anglicanism at a global level. And it adopts that understanding of Anglicanism. I mean, it's almost identical, I won't go into the very small differences, but it's almost identical to that Chicago resolution. And that becomes formative for the identity of Anglicanism at a global level. So you want to come into the Anglican Communion, this is all you need to do, to subscribe to. And again, nothing English is included in that, nothing English in terms of the Book of Common Prayer or the formularies of the Church. The question is that enough for regulating Anglicanism at a global level? Is that sort of identity that's there? So if I just put on another slide, this is something to confuse Americans completely. That is a game that we call cricket.
You've seen that,
yeah, you see that now. Yeah. So that's cricket. Cricket is one of those institutions that's grown in most parts of the Anglican Communion, except obviously in this part of the Anglican Communion. But in most parts of the world, cricket is played in those places with large Anglican churches, particularly in India, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Cricket is interesting in how you regulate cricket at an international level. Is if you want to play what they call test matches, if you want to play at an international level, then you have to abide by a set of rules, and those rules are regulated by the International Cricket Conference. And the headquarters are now in Dubai. You can see money actually goes with cricket like in every other sport. The headquarters are now in Dubai. But to play cricket, you have to abide by that set of rules, and it's protected in a kind of a quality assurance office, if you like. And the sanction is, quite obviously, if you don't abide by the rules, then you can't play. and in 1972, South Africa was kicked out of the International Cricket Council, as it was then. It was kicked out of that regulatory body on the grounds of apartheid. So because they refused to allow equality of players, then they weren't any longer allowed to play Test cricket. But it was very straightforward. The regulation was very straightforward, and there was a set of rules that people had to abide by. That's straightforward regulation. But ask yourself the question, what kind of rules do the Anglican churches have to play by and abide by? Who controls them, and where is that quality control office? Just look at a couple more sort of, I don't know whether people have that strange object on the on the right of that slide, the vacuum cleaner. Do people get Dyson vacuum cleaners? They're very strange. It's all design. I don't know how functional they are, but they look like fun. And the Nike trainers, obviously. I think Nike trainers' head office is in Oregon somewhere, isn't it?
Portland.
Yeah. So you've got there, obviously, a quality control office in Portland designing, that revolting object, piece of footwear. But there is obviously a quality control office and a strong sort of product brand development office and quality control. But I guess they're made in all sorts of parts of the world, probably in Vietnam and places of very cheap labour. And I think there's been various bits in the news where they're not paying living wages and all that sort of thing. But you can see the issue being, you've got a strong product made all over the world, but still regulated very strongly from the centre. And the same is true of the vacuum cleaner. They were initially made in England, but the English manufacturing was too expensive, so they delegated the manufacturing to factories in Malaysia. But the Quality Assurance Office and the Product Development and Design Office is still in England. And quite clearly, straightforward Western, if you like, Western identity, and then manufactured in all sorts of parts of the global south. Other obvious brands, Coca-Cola, and that's very interesting, the real thing, as an old advert for Coca-Cola there, based in Atlanta. Presumably there's a formula somewhere that's locked in some bank vault, so you can be guaranteed you'll get the same sickly drink wherever you are in the world. That will rot, it'll equally rot your teeth whether you're in this country or anywhere else. So you've got that kind of very strong product recognition, a very strong identity, and a very strong quality control office, and trademark control, I guess. What kind of thing is Anglicanism? It might be much more like the other form of Coca-Cola, cola, a local product. The biggest selling Indian sweet, sticky, cola-flavoured drink is Campa Cola, which resembles Coca-Cola, but if you can imagine, it's significantly sweeter, which is saying something, but it is significantly sweeter. It's designed to induce diabetes almost instantaneously. But it is something based on Coca-Cola, but it's kind of locally adapted to the needs of that particular society, if you like. It's got that kind of relationship with that product, the real thing from outside, but it's adapted itself and developed itself very differently. And if you're thinking through what kind of thing is Anglicanism, it's much more like that product that's come out of something else, developed its own set of identities, but then gone its own course, developed itself with some kind of relationship with the outside, but still now developing itself in a different kind of way. Anglican identity is problematic, and that's partly because we don't have a quality control office. As Anglicans, where is that quality control office, if you like? Where is that regulation? Is there a regulation? What does the product look like? I mean, these are all very secular and rather banal analogies, but nevertheless, it does say something about what does that identity look like at a global level, and where do we find it? So just one or two other little aspects. I'll pause there actually because maybe a few points people might want to raise.
One thing to consider is it's always been said that it's the connection, the communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's not
Its communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury is what's happened as a way of identifying Anglicanism almost by accident, because there's not much else. And that's partly what's I put down there, the First Lambeth Conference of 1867. I mean, one of the issues, I suppose, is when you've got very rapid missionary expansion, large numbers of new Christians, new churches growing, there is a sort of sense of a kind of momentum there, and there's a development and a spread very rapidly, and the conflict isn't necessarily there. And it's only, why do you need regulation? You need regulation when there's conflict, because you've got to decide, you've got to make decisions about who's in, who's out. And from the very beginnings of the Christian church, that was always the case, deciding what was authentic Christianity and what wasn't. And in its own way, the Anglican Communion has tried to do that since people started falling out with one another. And I guess the identity of the global institutions of Anglicanism, such as they are, begin to emerge because provinces or churches begin to fall out with one another. And that's where the identity comes from, and that's why the identity being found in the Archbishop of Canterbury becomes quite important. So I just got that. There's another question.
Yes. At what point do the various colonial, or points, I'm sure there are many, but in this kind of narrative arc, do the colonial bishops or the colonial churches no longer fall under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of London?
Well, as soon as they start getting their own bishop, so the Bishop of London no longer has jurisdiction. So from the development of the Bishop of Calcutta, who has oversight of everywhere from India to New Zealand when he first set up.
So is anybody, as it were, over the Bishop of Calcutta?
Well, the Archbishop of Canterbury, they still had a relationship with the English Church. It's quite a complicated relationship.
Yes.
So that he still functioned as a metropolitan at that stage. And then gradually those other churches gained their own independence. Nowadays we tend to use the word primate, but the word metropolitan was still used at that stage. So the metropolitan had the sort of superior jurisdiction over the other bishops. So gradually the Bishop of Calcutta became metropolitan in India. And that sort of emerges, and I think it's the 1840s you start getting those discussions. In South Africa, the Bishop of Cape Town becomes metropolitan from 1852. So those are the sort of stages where these bishops gain complete independence from Canterbury. And some of this comes with the development of synodical government as well. So in New Zealand, for instance, Bishop Selwyn they set up the Independent Church of New Zealand from the 1860s, early 1860s. And that has its own sort of synodical structures. So there's gradual development in the white colonies, it was to begin with, of independent churches, beginning with Calcutta really, and then moving on to the other churches afterwards. Yeah.
Just an American observation is that it's only relatively recently that our presiding bishop called herself primate. That is a very recent development in the American church, and literally the presiding bishop as a separate entity is only less than a century old. So that's a very different kind of trajectory than Calcutta was.
I mean, the American church never had a primate, never had a metropolitan. It doesn't really to this day.
Until, well, we call them private now.
Yeah. So again, each church adopted its own different ways of doing things. Some of that much less hierarchical. The American church less hierarchical, but it's partly to do with the American Constitution. The different states all have their own identity. Just one or two other issues. Just the first big conflict in the Anglican Communion was over Bishop Colenso. Bishop Colenso was appointed Bishop of Natal in southern Africa as the Queen's Bishop of Natal in southern Africa in 1851. He is a broad churchman, and one of the things he does as soon as he gets to Natal is to translate the Bible into Zulu. The majority of his population is Zulu speaking, and he translates the Bible into Zulu. And the question that he encounters, as any biblical translator would know, is what word do you use for God? Do you transliterate the Hebrew words for God, Elohim or Jehovah or whatever, or do you use the local word for supreme being or whatever? And it's his decision to use that local word. That creates a bit of a stir at the time, particularly among more evangelically minded missionaries. And at the same time, he's working fundamentally in a polygamous society. Another aspect of what he wants to do is to work out what do you do when you become a Christian. What do you do with all your wives? If you're a male, you become a Christian, what do you do with your 6, 7, 8 wives or whatever? Do you live with one and leave the others destitute, or do you live with one and care for the others? Those are questions that indeed they're still being asked in different parts of the Anglican Communion to this day. It's still a big issue in Kenya. But this was what he was asking. He adopted the policy that you needed to keep and contain and care for your wives. He was also began to question whether Jesus died for everybody or just for the elect, which again was, in those days, that was a major bone of contention. He felt that Jesus died for everybody, black and white included. This created a stir. Universalism is what created the stir. And the Bishop of Cape Town, who was Robert Gray there in the picture, a high churchman, tried to depose Colenso from his diocese in Pietermaritzburg, that's where his cathedral was. This creates a real stir throughout the Anglican Communion. That word is now being used, Anglican Communion. It's used from about 1850. There's a big gathering of bishops from the SPG in London in 1851, where the Great Exhibition was being held. They had a bishops' conference alongside that, and that's the first time they used this term. But a lot of bishops from across the world realised that, or want to do something about Bishop Colenso because they consider him to be a heretic. But they also recognise that there's no way of silencing, there's no kind of international mechanism for silencing Bishop Colenso. And so a number of Canadian bishops and a number of Bishop Selwyn in New Zealand have a campaign to try and get the Archbishop of Canterbury, that rather elderly looking character, Charles Longley, to try and call a meeting, a gathering of all the bishops from across the Anglican Communion to see whether they can address the issue of an errant bishop in southern Africa. It took a long time for Longley to be persuaded to convene a meeting because he recognised that his jurisdiction was solely within England. He was the Queen's bishop working within the Church of England, and he had no jurisdiction beyond England. And it's interesting, that very first Lambeth conference, the Archbishop of York refuses to go because he can't work out how this international gathering could ever have any jurisdiction over the Church of England for a start, or the other way around, how this international gathering, how the Church of England could have any exercise any authority outside of England. So it's a questionable authority from the very beginning. But the American bishops come, and the bishops from as far afield as Honolulu managed to come. In those days it was an English bishop in Honolulu, but he came all the way to London to gather for a 3-day conference. I don't know how long it took to get from Honolulu to London in those days, but a long time. So they gather, and they want the case of Bishop Colenso discussed. But Archbishop Longley, because he realises there is no obvious authority for this conference, refuses to put that on the agenda. So they meet together for 3 days, and there aren't even any minutes taken, which is quite interesting. So it's a gathering which isn't sure what it's for. So they meet together, They obviously have some kind of moral authority. Bishops are obviously have some kind of moral authority when they meet together. But canonical authority is questionable. What can they do anything sort of with a legal jurisdiction beyond their own territories? And the answer was they decided that they couldn't. But they could write letters and they could issue resolutions, which would only carry the weight of the voices issuing those resolutions and nothing more than that. And what's fascinating really is that Anglicanism adopted that model and never changed it. So even though it gradually gets bigger and even though it becomes a real big jamboree as it develops, so they agree to meet about every 10 years. So they meet again in 1888 and then carry on meeting approximately every 10 years since. What they agree upon is simply to issue resolutions on various issues of problems confronting, often coming out with the sort of the missionary expansion, issuing various resolutions, but they don't carry a kind of canonical force. And there isn't any other kind of mechanism of identity. They recognise from 1888, that every church can operate and adapt the prayer book, the English prayer book, as it sees fit for its own context. Because obviously you've got to begin to translate the prayer book into languages, local languages, but there's also calls to reorganise and put in new services and all sorts of things to the prayer book. So prayer book revision starts almost immediately, and it happens without recourse to the Church of England. So gradually you get the development of lots of independent voices who meet irregularly, only 10 years, every 10 years. It's not a regular meeting, or not a frequent meeting, so it's hard to do much by way of serious work when you're only meeting that infrequently. But in this time of missionary expansion, obviously there is a great sense in which we're growing and we're growing together. And without sort of condensing the whole of the history into 2 or 3 minutes, I think it's fair to say, right up until 1968, the problem was the problem of success, rapid growth, and there were various congresses that met alongside the Lambeth conferences, which were big jamborees really, which gathered together Anglicans from right across the world to look at how resources might be redistributed between the richer countries and the poorer countries. That was particularly true at Toronto in 1963. And that led to quite a lot of the redistribution from the American church to the churches in Africa, which still obviously continues to this day. But right up until 1968, there is a question of growth and success, and they decide they will set up a kind of standing committee for the Lambeth Conference that gets called the Anglican Consultative Council. That's established in 1968 and is a gathering of bishops and laity. It's the only body that within the Anglican Communion that has a constitution. The Lambeth Conference has no constitution. It's at the whim of the Archbishop of Canterbury to call it.
Similarly to the primates.
Pardon? And the Primates Conference was, so the Anglican Consultative Council was set up with a kind of legal authority. So it is a charity, according to English charity. That's its sort of constitutional background. And then you've got, in 1978, they decide that it would be good to have another body for consultation and prayer, which is this so-called primates meeting. So the senior bishops for each of the provinces, which are now 38 provinces, will be invited, again, by the Archbishop of Canterbury for particular questions as they might emerge in between Lambeth conferences, because obviously it's much cheaper to gather together 38 people rather than however many hundreds of bishops it now is. It's probably about 800 and something bishops these days. And again, the problems begin to emerge, and I suppose 1978 is the first one where there is major controversy, and that's immediately after the American Church has ordained the first women. And the question about what does that do for the Anglican Communion when one province at that stage, and very soon followed by the churches in Australia and New Zealand, when one province has ordained women and the others haven't. What does that say about the nature of communion? And what they agree in 1978 is that one province, it's up to each province to do as it will over the ordination of women, even though that might raise questions at a global level about whether those women can exercise ministry in other churches. Because if a church doesn't ordain women and doesn't see that they can be priests, then they can't function. And that's still the case in quite a number of provinces to this day, in Africa and elsewhere, don't ordain women. And that has created what was called very quickly impaired communion, but it hasn't questioned the global unity, if you like, of the Anglican Communion. It means that the interchange of ministry is more complex, but it hasn't sort of completely destroyed the workings of the Anglican Communion. So there's a kind of agreement to disagree that you could do these things. They were local decisions to be made, and we can still share in as much communion as is possible, despite those changes. So that's 1978. 1988 is the first time you get a discussion of same-sex relationships on the agenda. And it's a modest discussion, and in 1988 it's one of those things that churches in this country and in Canada have begun to talk about it by that stage, but there's no question about moving rapidly in that direction, recognising that it's taking quite a long time to produce reports and to come to conclusions. So in a sense it's on the agenda, but it doesn't become a particularly divisive issue. But by 1998, that's when things begin to heat up in relation to same-sex questions. You've also got 1998, the first women bishops attending a Lambeth conference. And this is where you get I won't go into the details again, but in 1998, it's on the agenda. There's a long report written about same-sex relationships, and there's a recognition within that report that there are so many disagreements and such different levels of understanding across the different churches in the Anglican Communion that it's not an issue that they can make a decision on. That's what it says in the reports that went to the Lambeth Conference in 1998. But in a completely unprecedented way, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, and who was George Carey, and Robin Eames, the Archbishop of Armagh, the Church of Ireland Archbishop, who's chairing the session, decide that they will introduce this amendments into the resolution. So the resolution initially would have said, we're not ready to come to a decision about this, and we need to do a lot more listening before we can ever come to any agreements. What happens is, during the course of the debate, an amendment is allowed that introduces a significant subclause, and that subclause says that homosexual practice is incompatible with Scripture. And obviously, if something's incompatible with Scripture, even on the basis of the minimal definition according to the Lambeth Quadrilateral, that raises the stakes. If it's against Scripture, if homosexual practice is against Scripture, and about 600 of the bishops in 1998 thought it was, and about 180 didn't, then it raises the game and makes things much more problematic. So a resolution is issued with that significant subclause. And it's interesting, the other half of the subclause says we should listen to homosexual people. So the positive listening process stuff is all in the same sentence, and yet you get this incompatibility with Scripture. And that makes it a kind of mark, a badge of identity from 1998. And so a number of churches from the global south, who have now begun to organise quite politically by this stage, begin to see Lambeth Resolution 110, as it was called, as a kind of marker of identity of what constitutes, if you like, authentic Anglicanism. So it becomes a kind of symbolic form of identity that's focused on this particular question of same-sex practice. And in a sense that wouldn't have, it was a highly divisive thing at the time, but it wouldn't necessarily have been communion splitting had it not been for the consecration in 2003 of Jean Robinson as Bishop of New Hampshire. And again, immediately afterwards, the question of authority within the Anglican Communion confronts the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. This happens almost immediately after his appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury. And there are serious threats of excommunication by a number of African churches, in particular of the Episcopal Church. And this is after some of those African churches have already set up missions to the Episcopal Church area. So the Anglican mission in America, which I think is the church in Rwanda, was one of the first. But it was also the church in Southeast Asia was also sending missionary bishops to work in the Episcopal area, the Episcopal Church's area. And that again had gone against the basic structures of how Anglicans have done things, of not interfering in one another's provinces. So things are coming to a head, and immediately after 2003 you've got an attempt to work out whether there is a way in which that conflict can be regulated or at least managed. And that is where we've got to in the last few years, to get the Archbishop of Canterbury, who always looked pensive, and I guess that's the reason, Rowan Williams right through his time. And there are serious disagreements, but there are also efforts made to try and work out whether there is a mechanism for regulating international Anglicanism that goes beyond the very minimum mechanism that's there in the Lambeth Conference and the Anglican Consultative Council and the Primates meeting. Can we create something, a mechanism, a form of identity that will regulate Anglicans as a kind of voluntary subscription to a set of doctrines, set of beliefs, and a mechanism for conflict resolution? And what comes out of the Primates meeting that emerges immediately after the consecration of Jean Robinson is the setting up of what they called the Windsor Commission, which met at Windsor to try and draw up a document, a kind of what they eventually decided to call a covenant, so an agreement that you voluntarily subscribe to work out whether there is a mechanism for regulating Anglicanism. And eventually a draft of that, a final draft of that, is produced, and it's going around the churches. But it's not going around the churches with any success at all, except what's interesting, the churches that have accepted it, I think there's been about 6 churches that have accepted it, are nearly all the very small Anglican churches. And it's presumably because belonging to something bigger is part of crucial of their identity. So the church in Mexico, which is a very liberal church, has adopted the covenant, partly because it needs its relationships with something much bigger. When you're a very small church in a predominantly Catholic society, as that church is, then presumably the desire to belong to something bigger is absolutely central to your identity. But the big churches, like the Church of England, haven't adopted the covenant. And I think the thing is now just collapsing. It's unlikely to make any further progress, whatever they're saying. I mean, it seems to me to be, if the Church of England doesn't adopt it, it's highly unlikely that the Archbishop of Canterbury is going to get it through other places. In a sense, it seems to be a dead letter. Just 2 other things. First of all, the global South churches have organised themselves in alliance with conservative churches, particularly in the United States. So you've got the creation of the Anglican Church in North America, which has very close relationships with the Global Anglican Futures Conference, which is an organisation that has become, if you like, a kind of an alternative model for what Anglicanism might be. They met just before the last Lambeth Conference in 2008 in Jerusalem, and there you can see about 200 bishops or so went to Jerusalem. Some of them then came on to Lambeth afterwards, but the majority didn't, as a kind of alternative gathering. And what they do is to adopt a much more doctrinal and basis for what constitutes Anglicanism, with much firmer boundaries, both on doctrine but also on ethical practice. So Anglican identity gets focused again on that symbolic identity that's focused on same-sex practice. GAFCON has met now, it's only met twice in large gatherings, partly because they keep falling out with one another, but that's another question. Again, it's quite difficult to get them to work together beyond their own sort of provincial identity. But this is serious threats in 2008 for a split of the Lambeth Conference, of Anglicanism altogether. 2008, there's questions about whether the Lambeth Conference will just collapse. And the people who plan it decide that it's going to be very different from any previous Lambeth Conference. So it won't issue resolutions, it won't issue encyclical letters. Instead, it will function as a mechanism really for listening. And what's surprising about it is that for those bishops who went, it was surprisingly successful. It didn't sort of collapse. Bishops from very different contexts did listen to one another and were given a good airing. The mechanism was a kind of African-based Indaba process where people are encouraged to listen and to put themselves in the perspective of the other person in order to try and understand where they're coming from. And so there was a lot of listening that went on there. But obviously there were 200 people who didn't show up from some of those more volatile churches. Had a question at the back?
Right, just a quick, if you can help me remember, there was one who showed up but wasn't allowed in, Gene Robinson.
Yes.
Yeah,
Can you say a little bit
yes.
more about that decision?
The Arch, I think, partly in order to get to ensure that as big an attendance as possible, it was agreed that Gene Robinson, I mean, this wasn't just the Archbishop of Canterbury, it was agreed by the organising body, which included Episcopalians. It was agreed that Gene Robinson wouldn't be invited, and neither would Martin Minns, who was the bishop from the Anglican Mission in America at that stage, I think. So they wouldn't be invited. But Gene Robinson, being Gene Robinson, showed up anyway. And he hung around for most of the time in the kind of refreshment tents, actually plugging his book. But anyway, we won't go into too much on that. But yes, so I mean, it wasn't as it was a complicated period, and I was with Catherine Jeffords Shorey last week, talking about the current issues, and her perspective was that things got worse and worse and worse. So after 2008, you had the next stage where bishops refused to share in communion with one another. They even refused to show up if she showed up at the primates conference. And from her perspective, things have been improving significantly since 2008, and things have become easier. And that may not be what it looks like from this perspective, but from her perspective, in discussion with Michael Curry, is that there is a change and a desire to work together. And that's where one can be quite optimistic about this. So just thinking through about how we move into the future and what's happening. I've got a picture here of the primates meeting at Canterbury, which was, 3 weeks ago now. What's different about it is, first of all, they all show up, including the Archbishop of Uganda, who had said that he wouldn't be showing up beforehand. But he shows up, and he's the only one that disappears before the end, because his synod had said that if you're not able to meet with the American presiding bishop, but he does meet with the American presiding bishop, but has to withdraw according to the decision of his own synod before the end. But the rest stay to the end. But the condition was that they would also invite the bishop of the Anglican Church in North America to that gathering, which has been recognised by a number of those churches. But they show up, they share in communion with one another. Again, that's not something they did a few years beforehand at Dar es Salaam and Alexandria, the two earlier meetings of the primates meeting. They hadn't met together and shown up and shared communion. What's actually happened is the American church has been, or the Episcopal Church has been asked to withdraw itself from Anglican consultative bodies and bodies that make decisions. Now, what that precisely means is quite difficult to know. What are those bodies? They are ecumenical bodies. There is also the Inter-Anglican, I can't remember what it's called. There's the that's the one. That's what it's called. It's got a rather long-winded name, an Iaskophon or something. But they've been asked to withdraw from those, or have they? Only if they make decisions. And it's one of the. I was with one of the members of that who had in fact been phoned up to asked to leave it. But does the primates meeting have the authority to ask those to leave? The answer to that is no. They have obviously a moral authority, and they can have a power of persuasion, but legally and canonically they have no authority to say anything. It's only the Anglican Consultative Council that can ask people to leave the Anglican Communion bodies, and that's meeting in Lusaka. I think it's in April or May. It's fairly soon anyway, isn't it? April. So it's about to meet. So where are we now in the Anglican Communion? I think the answer is we're in a relatively good place compared with what we were like 10 years ago. Despite the fact that the American Church has done what it's done in terms of changing its canons, there's also a sense in which a desire to work together and to walk together is the thing that's emerged out of that meeting a few weeks ago. And from what I've picked up is that seems to be a very genuine desire to walk together, and a recognition as well that where Anglicanism is strong is less in its kind of global bodies and much more in those other networks which operate almost everywhere across the Anglican Communion. I don't know whether the Diocese of Chicago has a particular relationship. Does it have a particular relationship with other parts, other dioceses, whatever? And that's true of virtually every diocese in the country. Every diocese in every church has some kind of relationship across the global church, which is completely separate from those official bodies of Anglicanism. And for Anglicanism to dissolve, it would require each church formally to excommunicate all those other churches. And that the chances of that happening, I would have thought, are negligible. So you can be expelled from the global body, but that doesn't mean that Anglicanism separates and falls to pieces, because you've got all those other networks at parochial, diocesan, provincial level that give a totally different kind of identity to Anglicanism. Question?
I would ask, if we've been isolated out in these particular circumstances, have there been the people who conflict most seriously with us, has that end also been set aside or told that they can't join? I mean, if you leave yourselves the center, people might be able to, get back in eventually. But if you've taken sides that seriously, it's back.
It's a problematic thing. I mean, the Anglican Church in North America is a very interesting body because it's not part of the Anglican Communion, even though it's recognised now. So it's not part of the Anglican Communion in the sense that it's not part of those formal bodies. And yet it's now recognised by quite a number of those global South bodies as the authentic voice of Anglicanism in North America. And yet the Episcopal Church is obviously still part of the Anglican Communion, even if it's been asked to withdraw from certain bodies for 3 years. So you've got it's a very complex situation that the churches are in at the moment.
But what would you suggest we actually do then? Just sit here and take it, or fight back?
I mean, I think there's 3 years respite, and they're appointing, at the moment they're appointing a task force, which is the Archbishop of Canterbury's great solution to everything is to appoint a task force. That task force will try and work out, I guess, what kind of minimum levels of agreement are required in order to walk together into the longer term future. And is this issue, the particular issue, presenting issue of same-sex marriage, it was interesting, it wasn't about homosexual practice this time, it was simply about same-sex marriage on the actual communique. So it's actually moved further away from some of the issues that are particularly conflictual. So I guess what will emerge out of that task force is a mechanism for trying to work out whether it's possible to have different understandings of the nature of marriage and still be able to recognise one another as authentic bodies, authentic churches at a global level. Whether that's possible is another question altogether. And I imagine what will happen after 3 years is another decision to walk together for a further period of time. Because by that stage, other churches will also probably, the Canadian Church is quite likely to, the New Zealand Church is quite likely to recognise same-sex marriage.
What about the Church of England?
Church of England, the Church of England won't recognise same-sex marriage in short term because the Church of England contains within it significant numbers of conservative evangelicals. And there's no other way, unlike, there isn't really a denominational landscape in England. There is either the Church of England or is there Roman Catholicism, and all the other denominations have collapsed. So there's nowhere to go. It's a sense in which they all stay within the Church of England. So it is a much more conflicted body than the American Church. So it's as though all those churches that have left the Anglican Communion are still in the Church of England. So there is a highly different kind of landscape. So the chances of having a recognition of same-sex marriage in the Church of England are negligible. That doesn't mean, however, that they won't allow clergy to do same-sex blessings but without authorised rites. We'll have a fudge, which is always how things work in the Church of England. Yeah.
Even here in the United States, some of the states are trying to do what they can to reverse same-sex marriage on a local level by passing laws and stuff. So I think the battle's not over even here. But don't you think, or do you think that we who have been more inclusive and more the feeling of universal love have some responsibility to go to these other areas, such as Africa and that, who are really very discriminating?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other dimension. Is one of the things that came out of the communique, which was highly positive, is that they did ask for. So whatever the views might be on same-sex marriage, there was a very strong condemnation of homophobia, which came into that, and large numbers of people wrote, including myself, wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury beforehand to ensure that whatever they might decide, they would also need to condemn homophobia at a global level.
And the Archbishop said at Synod last week or so that if any of the Anglican churches actively advocate criminalization of homosexuality, that they would be subject to the same consequences as the Episcopal Church.
Yes, which is quite a strong threat. It is quite a strong threat, and so again, there is movement, and things are changing. And I think there's probably a recognition within some of those African churches that actually they can't just carry on being as discriminatory as they have been, and that's particularly true in Uganda. Sorry.
No, Richard, go ahead.
I'm shifting emphasis a little bit from same-sex marriage, homosexuality, to a slightly different but very related issue, namely the tradition we have. There can only be one. If this is the tradition, there can only be one Anglican recognized church in the country. So Tesla, for example, I don't know if it should, but will they likely take up the issue of whether ACNA, along with the Episcopal Church in the United States, ought to be recognized as
I imagine that will be on the agenda. Again, with rare exceptions, parallel jurisdictions or overlapping jurisdictions has traditionally not been recognised within the Anglican Communion. And in Europe is an interesting example where there are lots of parallel jurisdictions. The American Church, the Church of England, the Old Catholics, the Spanish Reformed Church and the Portuguese Reformed Church, the Lusitanian Church, all have jurisdictions that overlap. So there are those questions, but that's because obviously Anglicanism is not kind of a dominant religion in those kind of places at all. So I guess that'll be on the agenda. But in practice, because there's already the kind of overlapping jurisdictions, that sort of strange Venn diagram of who recognises who within the Anglican world. I mean, one of the
this would be a change because then the urge would be people to recognize both jurisdictions or all of them. Not all jurisdictions possible, but for example, in the United States. Again, whether that would be proven or not, I don't know. But that's what they can take.
I mean, there's the visceral side of things as well. And I guess one of the things out of the Episcopal Church's relationship with the other Anglican bodies is quite strong and quite, there is a sense in which the kind of legal disputes and all that side of things can't be sort of pushed out of the question.
We have them here.
Yeah. But they're not, they are obviously that creates a form of conflict which is at a level that isn't just intellectual. Some question at the back.
The Columba Declaration and the issue of Church of England establishing ties with the Church of Scotland without consultation from the Scottish Episcopal Church. How does that play in actually to this sort of multiple jurisdiction and lack of boundary?
Yes, I mean that's for those who don't follow the politics of the Church of England too closely, which I guess is most people. Last week we had the General Synod. I'm a member of General Synod at the moment, so I went back home. And one of the things on the agenda was a new agreement between the Church of England, a doctrinal agreement between the Church of England and the Reformed Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And the discussion there had been quite complicated because of as I mentioned, the Episcopal Church of Scotland being a small, disestablished, and always quite a sort of a body that valued its independence, but part of the Anglican Communion. And initially, the discussions had included the Scottish Episcopal Church, who had, for their own reasons, withdrawn from the discussion. And then the presiding bishop, or the primus as he's called, of the Scottish Episcopal Church, has come out exceptionally strongly against the Church of England coming to any kind of doctrinal agreement with the Church of Scotland. I can't quite understand why, to be absolutely honest. What the Church of England does with another church in another country, as indeed the Church of Scotland is up to the Church of England. But the Episcopal Church of Scotland has withdrawn from those discussions. It seems not to want an agreement with the Church of Scotland, which might question its own identity, I suppose. But it is quite a complicated one because they were part of the whole process and then they voluntarily withdrew. They weren't kicked out or anything like that, but they didn't like the way it was going and didn't want a kind of doctrinal agreement. But that may be because the Episcopal Church of Scotland is declining extremely rapidly and is losing quite a lot of its congregations. So it may be its own sort of identity, it feels under threat. But it's difficult to know. Any other questions or anything?
It's really unrelated, but the question did come up to me when you were showing a couple of those photos of has the same process gone all the way through these hundreds of years about human chattel slavery?
I suppose that's an interesting question. I mean, it in a sense, the Anglican Communion is later than formal slavery, but it's frequently recognised. I mean, there's been quite a number of resolutions which have talked about slavery in its new guises, in its different forms, at various stages, but it's not been particularly high on the agenda. I mean, I guess it's partly because of when the debates emerge and what they're about. So slavery hasn't been too high, but interestingly, sexuality has. So.
But slavery is still a reality.
It is a reality,
Some of
and
these places where
there's been quite a lot of resolutions about it. But again, it's not. I mean, it's not been, I guess, one of the major issues in the Anglican Communion over the time. But there's quite a lot of good Anglican work on slavery to this day.
yes, but there was a lot of good Anglican work on perpetuating it.
But I mean, at the moment, there's an Anglican, one of the Anglican commissions is on human trafficking and environmency, which is again producing some quite good work, trying to counter human trafficking and environmency.
One of the differences is that nobody's for it anymore.
Well,
You mean the
That's-
slavery?
Yes.
that
Well,
right.
but that's not true, I wouldn't say. I mean, all of Nigeria, all over Africa, they're still enslaving people who don't agree with them politically or religiously. And it's formal slavery.
Well, why don't we continue this discussion
Yeah, well-
over refreshments? You've been talking to us for quite a while, and we want to thank you for this wonderful time. Thanks very much.